So one question that I get asked a lot is, which chess opening should I play? And it's a good question, right? Especially for beginners. There's so many different openings out there. How do you know which one you should play? So in this video, I'm going to talk about the different types of openings that are available and why you would choose one over another. And then I'm going to give you a step-by-step process you can follow to figure out which one would be best suited for you. So we've got a lot to cover. Let's jump right in. So all chess openings can very broadly fall under two categories. The first category is what we would call setup-based or positional type of openings. So an example of this would be the London system. In the London system, white would play d4, followed by knight f3, bishop f4, e3, bishop d3, knight bd2, and c3, and then castles. So this setup with the pawn on d4, protected by these pawns, the bishop on f4, bishop on d3, and then the knights on f3 and d2, this is the setup that you're going to play probably 9 out of 10 games when you play the London system. You know, unless black does something really weird or crazy, you're going to play almost every game the same exact moves. You're going to go for this setup. Another example for white would be the King's Indian attack. Knight f3, d3, g3, bishop g2, castles, knight b to d2. This setup where you fiend shadow your bishop behind the g2 pawn, you connect your knights, you play d3, and eventually you're going to, counterattack in the center with e4 or c4. This setup, 9 out of 10 games, if not more, you're going to play these same exact moves. And one more example from black's perspective of a setup-based type opening would be the Slav defense. So against d4, you would play d5, and against the queen's gambit, you would simply play c6, followed by knight f6, bishop f5, e6, knight bd7. And you can see this setup, you're going to play pretty much every game against d4. And this is actually very similar to the London system. If I flip back, you can see how they both kind of support that central pawn, and then the bishops go behind it. Very similar in the Slav defense. All right, so those are some examples of setup-based or positional type openings. Now, the other group of openings that we have are what are called theory-based or tactical openings. So an example of a tactical or theory-based opening would be something maybe like the King's Gambit. So e4, e5, and we play f4. Very aggressive move. We're opening up our king to attack the center in a kind of a weird way right off the bat. And the King's Gambit accepted, knight f3, g5, bishop c4. One of the main lines goes g4, castles, and you sacrifice your knight to gain quick development, bring out your queen, and get some serious pressure. And black has to be really careful he doesn't end up getting checkmated right out of the opening. And you can probably see how this is very different from something like the London system. In the London system, I'm going to play these same moves pretty much every game. In the King's Gambit, my moves are going to vary greatly depending on what my opponent does. I mean, this is just one line that we looked at, but if we back up, black didn't have to play this, right? He could have played any number of things, and I would have had to have been prepared for that. Here's another example from black's perspective of a tactical or theory-based opening. It's the Scandinavian defense. You play d5 against e4, and after white captures, one line that I like to play is knight to f6. And then after c4, you can play what is called the Icelandic gambit. e6, captures, and then d4. And then after like bishop b4 check, you get this really crazy position where black has sacrificed a pawn and given white control of the center, but in return, black has 3 pieces already developed. He's about to castle, bring his rook to the center. He has a lot of compensation, but you get some really wild and crazy positions. So the important thing to understand is that these two different groups of openings are very different. If you're going to play a setup-based or positional opening, you're going to get positions that are much different than if you play a tactical kind of a theory-based opening. So I put together this little chart so you can kind of compare the differences. So if we look at the setup-based positional, usually you're going to have the same setup. So if I go back to my example here, the London system, you're going to play these same moves pretty much every game and get the same kind of setup. If I go to the tactical or theory-based King's Gambit, depending on what black does, you're going to get some very different positions. He didn't have to play this g5 line. He could have played, there's another line where he plays d5, or where he plays knight f6, or bishop e7. There's lots of different options that black might play. Also, the setup-based positional openings tend to be a little bit slower paced. Looking at the London system, you can see that there's not a lot of tension in the position. Really, there's only one capture that could even happen. And apart from that, both sides are kind of staying back, not being super aggressive. The games generally tend to be more strategic. Positional ideas are important. There's lots of maneuvering that happens. So for example, if white decides he wants to attack black's king, maybe he's going to play rook e1, bring the knight back to f1, knight to g3, maneuvering pieces around. Maybe black decides he's going to attack on the queen side. He's going to move his bishop, his queen, and then bring this rook over. Because the game is slower paced, you generally have time for more maneuvering and things like that. Jumping back to the Icelandic gambit example, if white decides, oh, well, I'd like to maneuver this knight around to come over here on the queen side because I want to start some queen side plan, he doesn't have time, right? He's in check. He's got to deal with the fact that I have 3 pieces out already. At the same time, I have to be careful and deal with the fact that, hey, this pawn could come forward. It's a much faster paced game. You're not going to have lots of maneuvering. It's going to be more about tactics. Like, who's going to spot the tactic correctly? Who's going to find the tactical combination to win the game? One more thing I'll say about these tactical openings is that there tends to be a lot more mistakes. Both players have a harder time navigating the positions usually, and so you end up with a lot more blunders. And that could go for you or against you. So the last thing I'll kind of point out here is that generally the setup-based openings tend to be quicker and easier to learn because really all you have to learn is, okay, the pawn goes on d4, you defend it with these, and this is where my pieces go, and I'm going to do that every single time. It doesn't take a lot of time and effort to learn that. If you go back to the Icelandic gambit, there's a lot happening in this position. You're not going to be able to just pick this up and start playing it in a day or two and expect things to go well, unless you're really, really, really good at tactics. So to kind of summarize, I would say if you're looking for something kind of quick and easy to pick up fast and you don't have a lot of time, I would go for some sort of a setup-based opening. So something like the London system where you're going to play d4 and then you're going to develop your pieces pretty much the same way every time. Or the King's Indian attack or the King's Indian defense where you're going to fiend shuttle your bishop, your knights and pawns are going to go to the same squares. That's pretty quick and you can kind of pick that up and start playing it in a couple days. Now, if you have more time and want to put in a little more effort to learn something like the King's Gambit or the Icelandic Gambit, or really a lot of the gambits tend to be more tactical, you're going to get a lot of value out of that, but you are going to have to put in more work. Okay, so now that you understand kind of the 2 main categories of different types of openings, I want to give you my recommendation on how I would personally go about choosing an opening. So step number 1, I would play 5 games with a tactical or a theory-based opening, and I'd play another 5 games with the positional setup-based opening. And it could be any one, doesn't have to be a specific one. You can choose one of the ones that I talked about, or you can find your own, but play 5 games with each different type of opening. And then at the end of those 10 games, ask yourself the question, which ones do you feel more comfortable in? So if you're a very tactical person and you like solving tactics puzzles and you feel like you're pretty good at solving tactics puzzles, maybe you enjoy the tactical openings where it's very aggressive and it's very kind of crazy in wild positions. If, on the other hand, you like the slower paced, kind of a gradual build up throughout the game, and then eventually you figure out a way to win in the end game, maybe, you probably are going to like the positional setup based openings. But after 10 games, you should have an idea and kind of realize, okay, I think I like either the tactical or I like the positional openings better. So after you've figured out if you like tactical or positional openings, my recommendation would be then choose 2 or 3 different either tactical openings, if that's what you chose, or 2 or 3 different positional openings, so you can get a feel for the differences within that category. And again, I would play at least 5 games with each one and try to get an idea, okay, which ones do I enjoy playing? And the third thing I would say about choosing an opening is don't rush those first 2 steps. So when you're going through the positional and tactical, and then when you choose one and you're going through specific openings, take your time. When I was 10 or 11, I got a book for Christmas on bishop b5 Sicilian lines. So e4, c5, knight f3, and after d6, the main line is d4, but the lines that I learned from my book were bishop b5 check, and I started playing those, and here I am 20-something years later, and I still play bishop b5 Sicilian lines most of the time. So the point is, once you go through the effort to learn an opening, you might end up sticking with that for a long time. It takes a lot of work to switch to a new opening after you kind of get used to playing a certain one. So it's worth it right now up front to really explore a lot of different options and find an opening that you're comfortable with that suits your playing style before you spend a ton of time learning it and playing it, because you might be stuck with that for a while. And a couple of closing thoughts. Usually if you're white and you play d4, it tends to lead to the more positional setup-based openings. We saw the London system, how you played knight f3, bishop f4, e3. That's one example. There are a couple of others that stem out of the d4 lines. Generally speaking, e4 will lead to more tactical and theory-based openings, so some Sicilian defense lines can get very tricky. We looked at the king's gambit. There are a lot of other gambits. D4 captures c3. This is the Danish gambit, is one that's very crazy. Bishop c4, you actually give up several pawns and you get this nice development. Lots of gambits that you can check out with e4 for white. And when you're playing black, it's a lot harder to steer the game in the direction you want, because obviously you have to react to what white does. If he plays e4, it's going to be very hard to get a positional setup-based type of game if white doesn't want to go that route. Now, if white plays d4 and you want to play for a setup-based opening, we talked about the Slav, d5, c6, knight f6, bishop f5, e6. There's a good chance you can do that. But if he plays e4, you're probably going to have to be prepared for some sort of a tactical game if that's the route white wants to go. It's going to be very hard for you to force a positional game against e4. I hope you got some value out of that and gained a little bit of insight into what goes into choosing an opening and what kind might be best suited for you. Let me know in the comments if I left out anything important that you would like to know. I'd be happy to answer those. If you learned something, please hit the thumbs up button. It really helps out. Thanks so much for watching. As always, stay sharp, play smart, and take care.